Distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, welcome to the 25th anniversary high-level dialogue on forests and the decade of action to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals and beyond. It is my pleasure to moderate the second high-level dialogue during COFO25. My name is Tony Simons and I'm the Executive Director of COFO Aircraft, and my task today is to guide us through this very important session. To provide, we are all becoming experts in Zoom, Teams and Skype, but please allow me to provide some technical information for those who have joined us specifically for this session, or those still struggling with that elusive mute button. Interpretation is available in Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian and Spanish, and it can be selected in the bottom bar in Zoom, and it's the 5th button in the bar of 6 buttons at the bottom. Today, we're going to be treated to 1 keynote and 5 exciting presentations. But we also want to take up some questions from the audience at the end and throughout the entire presentation. So please post them in the chat and please indicate which panelist the question is for. So please keep your microphone muted, as the echoes and sound distractions can dilute the wisdom and insights being presented. Note that this session is being recorded and is also being webcast. Now, COFO25 and the SDGs are part of an international journey that somehow started in Stockholm at the first Earth Summit in 1972. Indeed, the first COFO was held 3 weeks before the Stockholm Earth Summit, and it cross-referenced Stockholm repeatedly. The Stockholm report also generously cross-referenced forestry, and there were some 50 mentions in 8 out of the 109 recommendations. So, continuing on our international journey together, 20 years later at UNCED, although we failed to get a UN Framework Convention on Forests, we did have a staggering 297 mentions for forestry in the 351-page report. But then our journey seemed to go back a little, as in 2015 in the SDGs, we're somewhat underrepresented for a sector that covers 30% of the land, transpires 60% of water, houses 80% of terrestrial biodiversity. So in the SDG framework, we have 17 goals, 169 targets, and 232 unique indicators. And forestry is explicitly mentioned in only 1 goal, life on land. It's in 3 of the 169 targets and in only 2 of the 232 indicators. And this is likely going to explain to you why our keynote and 5 panelists will likely not just confine themselves to SDG 15. Now, trees evolved some 380 million years ago, and we've colonized Earth for 2,000 and have colonized Earth 2,000 times longer than humans. When trees evolved, our planet had CO2 concentrations 10 times higher than today, and average temperatures were 10 degrees hotter than they are today. It was trees that made the planet habitable for mammals and eventually humans. And their destruction will lead to the destruction of humans. So yes, if you want one soundbite for social media, it surely has to be no trees equals no humans. Now, there's a table to show here. I wonder if we could see that. I'm not seeing it. Could somebody give me some feedback if it's there? Oh, great, it's coming. Here we are. Thanks very much, Teresa. Now, if we look at this table, the state of people, forests, and climate, from 380 million years ago when trees did first evolve to 2045, we can see some interesting facts. You'll see that our planet once had 60% forest cover after the last glacial melt some 8,000 years ago. And we've now cut that down in half. And I guess the question is, how low do we want to go? So together we need to reimagine the role of forests to societies and to the climate. And by together, we mean not just the esteemed colleagues of member states in the audience, but the inhabitants of cities, the forest stewards, the rural folk, the private sector, our cultural leaders, but most importantly, the youth. And to help us in our reimagining exercise within the context of SDGs and COFO25, I would first like to call on a dear friend and colleague, Achim Steiner. Achim is currently the Executive Director of UNDP and has formerly been Executive Director of UNEP and the Director of the Oxford Martin School. His parentage is both from the Global South and the Global North. So I guess he comes from the global equator. And as such, he's well suited to give us that worldwide perspective. Now, Achim is not somebody who's satisfied with incremental change. So please welcome Achim to kick off this high-level dialogue. Achim, the floor and the mute button are yours.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's a great honor and pleasure to join you, to join Excellencies, colleagues, dear friends in FAO and friends of forests worldwide for this 25th anniversary of the high-level dialogue. I am very honored to have been invited, and I appreciate very much the perspective with which you just introduced, Tony, the topic of forests in our time. And in the background note, you asked us to reflect a little bit in terms of looking back, looking forward, and what needs to change. And I will take a few minutes only to highlight some of the thoughts that perhaps may not seem new to you, but I think, as always, the challenge for us is how do we prioritize, how do we focus, and how do we also deal with, in a sense, a closing time window. And that is why I offer, in all humility, but perhaps with a perspective that transcends the sectoral and really reaches into the domain of the SDGs and the focus also of our discussion today in looking at this. Now, let me begin because there was an interesting factoid in the background paper that in 1946, FAO's Forestry and Forest Product Division was established largely because there was a concern about lack of timber. It coincided with the darkest moment of the 20th century, the end of the Second World War, the establishment of the United Nations, and the yearning of peoples all over the world to rebuild, to reconstruct, but also to develop. And I think if you take that moment in time and then fast forward to the year 2020, and just yesterday I spoke to the latest satellite technology that is becoming available in terms of forest monitoring and the ability to observe what is happening, not just the forest cover, but with the latest technology, literally being able to determine the felling of a single tree in a forest. And it reminded me of the extraordinary journey that we have taken over these decades when it comes to our natural resources, and particularly in the context of our discussion today, of forests also. And you asked us what is the biggest challenge perhaps that we have faced when we look back. And I think in the English language there's a wonderful metaphor, seeing the forest for the trees. I think relationship to trees was essentially one of utilitarian, of use, and trees were materials, they were part of our lives, of our civilizations as they evolved. And yet, as we entered the 20th century, we also entered a period of extraordinary development, massive increase in not only people, but also consumption, and therefore also massive deforestation. And I think what strikes me, particularly in that second half of the 20th century, is that we face this challenge of not being able to recognize that trees are really just that, trees. Yet forests are so much more than just the individual trees. They are ecosystems. And perhaps the greatest challenge was that there was a degree of ecosystem invisibility, lack of appreciation. Instruction, you're muted. I'm not sure if that's, can you hear me, Tony?
Yes.
Yes,
Yep.
Sorry. Something appeared on my screen. And I think what the journey both of the committee, of FAO, of the world at large has been, perhaps over the last decades, is to overcome this lack of understanding, recognition, and in a sense, yes, the invisibility of the value of forest ecosystems embedded in an ecological system, but also in an economic and social system. And so as we look back on these decades, then our journey has been one that often was led by local communities. Let's think back to the Chipko movement, tree hugging, laughed at by many, but in fact an expression of desperation by local communities that simply saw far earlier the destruction that would emanate from deforestation than perhaps those who simply looked at it as an opportunity to open up land. But it has evolved. It went through the phase in Europe with the acid rain period where pollution threatened the future of forests. And it has covered obviously the massive agro-industrial expansions that have to do with the products that are part of our modern economy, but are driving deforestation across the globe. So I think that to me has been the journey of moving from a forestry science approach and a forestry management approach. Second half of the 20th century, many forest managers began to recognize this, but our way of looking at forests in land use planning, in economic planning, in sectoral policies lagged decades behind. And it was often communities, indigenous peoples, those who were at the forefront of losing those services who began to open our eyes. And since then, science has obviously taken us into a whole new realm to be able to understand this. So let me quickly look forward. You asked us, what is the biggest challenge? And I think without doubt, the challenge of our generation, of our time, is sustainability. And that is a very general term. So let me be very specific. It is climate change and it is the loss of ecosystem services. And in both, forests are a key variable of either failure or success. And we can take a planetary perspective. We can look at carbon sinks. We can look at overall forest cover. We can understand the significance of protecting, restoring, for instance, forest restoration done with a serious commitment over the next 10 years could remove 25 gigatons of carbon from our atmosphere. The contribution of forests to addressing the climate change challenge is enormous. It in fact exceeds any other possibility of acting in the short term. But with it comes also the extraordinary opportunity of restoration, of establishing or re-establishing ecosystem services, and programs such as Red Plus, with all their faults and the experimental phase that they're passing through, clearly are examples of how we are experimenting. And the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Climate Convention, the Desertification Convention are expressions of a collective realization. But again, our ability to actually follow through is lagging behind. But I mentioned a planetary perspective. And you know, when we meet at global level and in the United Nations, it's always very easy to aggregate and to take averages, and they hide so much reality. Nowhere is this more true than when we apply the second perspective, the people's perspective, the user's perspective, the communities that are excluded from using forests, the custodians, be they indigenous peoples, communities, or private landholders for that matter. And I think it is critical that as we look forward, we also understand that sustainability can not only be achieved through the aggregate management of more forest protected areas. We have to work with people as co-managers, as co-custodians, as co-investors, whether it's private landowners, whether it is communities, indigenous peoples. I think in every country, in every context, this will vary, but it is a fundamental element, not just planetary, but also people perspective. And finally, what needs to change? I think in much of what I have described, there is a very clear directional shift. And it is a systems perspective. And it is really the starting point where the SDGs really become in the decade of action, I think an extremely important point for all of us, but particularly also for you who are looking at forests in their totality, in a global context, in a national context. I think how forests relate to each one of the 17 SDGs, not just 15, may very well be the lens through which we can also bring a more systemic perspective to managing forests. We have learned many lessons, the incentives, the role of the private sector, private landholders, communities as co-managers, and also agroforestry. Tony, I have learned so much through you and the work of the World Agroforestry Center. Trees belong in the midst of our lives. They are not something that we put over there and then the rest somehow develops alongside. This is an equation for failure, and it's not the way to move forward. And I end by simply reminding us that in the midst of this pandemic, of this extraordinary economic freefall that we are going through now, the setbacks that we are seeing in developmental terms, the green recovery is also a unique opportunity to put forests at the center of not just a technological and a climate change technology fix, but rather also an extraordinary opportunity to reinvest in our ecological infrastructure, make it part of our everyday lives as it once was. But our relationship was broken somewhere between the 19th and 20th century, because the devastation that we have really caused to the world's ecology and ecological infrastructure was most visible in forests. But the turnarounds are there. There are many stories that can be told, and you know them well. And therefore, my perspective is the next 10 years is a decade in which we truly can bring a systems perspective, a turnaround, and address this major challenge of sustainability through the two great threats of climate change with all its consequences and the concomitant loss of ecosystem services, which really has been the silent crisis that is unfolding before us. And as head of UNDP, you will not be surprised if I am not only fully committed to working with our colleagues in FAO, with national institutions that are looking at forest management in the larger context of their nation's development. It is also as the integrator of the United Nations family of development institutions that we hope to bring that more systemic perspective to the future of forest management. Let me hand back to you, and thank you again for the opportunity to address you today. Thank you, Tony. You're on mute.
Finding the mute button. Akam, you're incredibly busy. We know you've got other pressing engagements there at the UN. It's been a delight to have you today. I'm not sure if you have time for another question, or we can continue a future. Do you have time for a quick question?
Yes, I think if there is one, I know there are other panelists, so I don't want to take any of their time.
It might be a quick question, but it perhaps could require a long answer. So let's put it out there as a challenge to everybody. But essentially, agriculture realized that when we look through the lens of GDP, which we know is an imperfect measure for productivity and prosperity, but when we look through that lens, agriculture was 4%. And therefore, the world didn't pay much attention to it. So we dressed it up as the food system, and we said, okay, let's ask the question, how much do people spend on food? And it goes up to 58% of household income in Nigeria. It's a much more impressive figure. So for forestry, we know that it's about 1.5% of global GDP. So it tends to get pretty ignored. So what's that elevating game, equivalent of agriculture to the food system? It's forestry to the functions of forests, to the values, both in terms of, value, cost, and price. Because when we look often through the REDD+ lens and just the value of carbon, we're not really capturing all of those wonderful ecosystem services that so how do we get from that REDD+ to a green plus excitement about forests?
Well, a very brief reflection from my side. I think, first of all, we have long passed the point where relying on GDP as the singular indicator of economic success, of progress and opportunity is a good compass. I think we are struggling because in its simplicity and its correlation to some extent, let us not deny that, it has defined progress and success in development for the better part of a century by now. But it is precisely in its blind spots, in what it excludes, that it is so often so misleading. It is also a discussion that when we look at per capita income, countries graduate often because of a particular factor in their national economy that lifts them above a certain per capita income level, and yet the majority of the population is still living in poverty and extreme poverty. I think the two directions that I clearly see in addressing this is, first of all, we need to capture also in economic terms, because at the end of the day, economics is a form of transacting information and decision-making criteria. But ecology and economics are not, on two different planets. It's just that we have been very slow in being able to bring them together. I think once you look at the full value that is there, not just in narrow economic terms, but certainly that is part of it. And it has to be part of the conversation about how to evolve beyond GDP. We begin to construct economies that are valued by, for example, their natural wealth that they retain in the development process rather than eroding their capital. We can also look at human welfare, human well-being. And let me end just with a very interesting point that some of you may be familiar with. Pawan Sukhdev, an economist, in his work on social forestry and in fact natural assets, looked also at the GDP of the poor. And it's very interesting where the statistics you mentioned at the national level are often in the single-digit figures. If you take the GDP of the poor, suddenly nature, natural resources, forests are so significant that they're actually 70 to 80% of the GDP of the poor. So this is another way of understanding that aggregation and averages can often be very misleading, and we have to understand forests in their totality, embedded in an economic, social, and ecological system. That, I think, is the way in which the kind of green economy that is emerging, an inclusive, sustainable economy of the 21st century, is moving very quickly, and the indicators that drive governments, investments, public budgets, legislation will also have to adjust. Thank you.
Great, Akam, thanks very much for those words of wisdom and your time as well. It's been tremendous. On behalf of the 276 participants and the several thousand people online, we've got a little just a little bit of applause there, because we know how terrible it is when, you know, this is such a sterile environment. So thank you for that. Pleased to have your continued interest. Look forward to carrying on the dialogue, and all progress to UNDP and yourself as you help us in the world with the SDGs and forestry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony.
Great. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel. And we have 5 panelists today. The first one is His Excellency, Mr. Saleh Karabshay. He's going to be represented, he's the Minister of Environment and Acting Minister of Agriculture in Jordan. And today he's going to be represented by Engineer Khalid Al-Manassir, who is the head of the Biodiversity Division at the Ministry of Agriculture, who will be speaking to us on behalf of Mr. Saleh Karabshay. So to Khalid, looking back, in your opinion, what has been the biggest challenge for Jordan and the Near East region, which forestry has contributed to solve? And what major lessons can be drawn from your experiences?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Actually, I will presenting on behalf of His Excellency Dr. Saleh Karabshay, as Minister of Environmental, Acting Ministry of Agriculture. I will speak by Arabic language, if I can.
Yes, you're very welcome to, Khalid. So we ask everyone to look at the. Yes, we can hear you. We ask everyone to look at the 6 buttons at the bottom in terms of interpretation, and to go there and to choose the language that you would like to listen into. Don't choose Arabic, choose the language that you would like to listen to. So please proceed, Khalid. Please proceed.
Okay. Actually, first I will speak by English. Forests in Jordan have, and I will continue to provide environmental for human and livelihoods by fixing carbon. Also providing clean water, providing energy source, also providing food and fodder. In recent years, the greatest potential forest for the role of the supporting livelihood of under community and by a group, by creating and the income resource. This rule was supporting livelihood, community impact, resource. Actually, we have a crisis, as we know, like Syrian refugee and many problems around Jordan. Now, this is also affecting of the economic and agriculture sector. Also, we have some problem in the fire problem and some problem with the low income in the who live in around of the forest area. Last 5 years, we have some support from many organized for contribute or support Jordan for solve this problem. Also, like help some people, as I say, for the this in the community. This for the solve of the big challenge of Jordan for forest. Yes.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Khalid, and a privilege for you to address us in English, but you can, if you further want to continue, you can continue in Arabic if you choose. Just continuing slightly,
Okay.
if we asked you to make a prediction, from your personal view, what would be the key challenge to your region 25 years from now in relation to forestry? So let's look ahead 25 years to the year 2045. What do you think the same challenges as today or the new challenges might emerge in relation to forestry and its effect on agriculture and land use generally?
تمام. ل 25 سنة يعني النظرة الآن هي التوسع في عمليات التشجير أو التحريج بالمناطق. هذا يؤدي إلى المزيد من خلق فرص العمل للمجتمعات المحلية التي تعيش بالقرب من الغابات. أيضا العنصر النساء يتم الحصول على فرص عمل، بالإضافة لمواجهة اللجوء الذي يحصل بالأردن الآن. أعتقد أنه إذا تم دعم الأردن بهذا الجانب، يتم تطوير غاباتنا، يتم خلق فرص عمل، يتم الحصول على دخل منتظم على مدار أعوام، وهذا ما يتم التخطيط له من خلال وضع سياسة غابات التي تم العمل عليها وإصدارها رسمي من قبل بالتعاون مع منظمة الأغذية والزراعة العالمية الفاو. فتم وضع سياسة غابات بالأردن وتم الموافقة عليها قبل شهرين تقريبا. هذه السياسة تم وضع العديد من الخطط بداخلها التي تنظر لأكثر من 10 أو 20 سنة إلى الأمام. هذه السياسة تحتاج إلى مزيد من الدعم من الجهات جميعا من أجل تطوير قطاع الغابات بالأردن، وأيضا خلق فرص عمل لجميع المواطنين، وأيضا اللاجئين خلق فرص عمل لهم.
Thank you very much, Khalid. So we'll come back to you in a moment, but now let's jump continents and go to the Americas. And it's a pleasure to welcome Ms. Beth McNeil. And Beth is the Assistant Deputy Minister for Natural Resources in Canada and the Canadian Forest Service. Good afternoon, Beth. So, Beth, none of us predicted that the world would be battling a global pandemic this year. And how is that related specifically to the Canadian Forest Service and the challenge that you've taken up?
Thank you, Tony. And can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine. Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. I'm very pleased to share with folks what we've done and how we view the importance of the forest sector in Canada in times of this COVID pandemic. And when I look at the sector in Canada, the communities and the industry, I look through three lenses when I consider the context of COVID: survive, stabilize, and reimagine. By surviving, what I'm referring to here is the health and safety of those who work in the forest sector, our firms, and their communities. Most of our industry is located in smaller rural communities that are concerned about the transmission of COVID from workers coming in either to plant trees or to fight wildland fires. And addressing these safety concerns was a priority for us in the early days of the pandemic. And governments developed rigorous protocols that are in place to protect communities, especially our Indigenous people. We also put in place assistance for firms to keep their workers on strength, to keep them healthy and safe, and whether it was wage subsidies, emergency relief, or resources to support a safe tree planting season. So in that survival mode, I'm very pleased to say that we had 0 cases of COVID-19 in our tree planting and our wildland firefighting work camps. And by stabilizing, what our governments did in Canada is we declared the forest sector, its services and products, as essential. And we ensured key products needed on a daily basis, like toilet paper, hygiene products, packaging, would continue to be produced and flow across borders. And second, we invested in short-term innovation. Our industry and research community stepped up in developing non-medical personal protective equipment, masks and gowns from forest fiber. And finally, the final lens is reimagine. How can we reimagine the sector in Canada? The forest sector and derived wood products are very much part of the solution in supporting a green economic recovery, incorporating the values of diversity and inclusion, while supporting Canada's goals to address a changing climate. This means advancing our bioeconomy framework and highlighting how Canada's forest sector will play a key role in achieving net zero by 2050. Whether it's through expanding mass timber construction, bioheat and bioenergy transition in our northern and remote communities, or through nature-based climate solutions of planting 2 billion trees over 10 years. The changing policy and regulatory context provides an opportunity to support transition. Thank you.
Beth, thanks very much. While we've got you still on the line, maybe a follow-up question would be, okay, you've done a tremendous job working with COVID-19, and to have no infections from those thousands of tree planters in the communities that you're visiting is great testimony to your planning and your ability to respond. Okay, so we all have business continuity plans, those things that we invoke when a crisis occurs. But kind of it seems like now our business continuity plan is business as usual. So what about, God forbid there wasn't, but if there was a COVID-24, what have you learned currently in relation to forests that it's going to prepare you when another crisis or another pandemic comes along? How more resilient and robust is the Canadian Forest Service because COVID has given us a bit of a wake-up call?
I think for us in Canada, the Canadian Forest Service, but recall that provinces and territories are responsible for managing our forests. I think we now have protocol in place. We realize the importance of declaring forestry, its services and products as essential. And this is really essential to the well-being of our rural communities. We have over 300 and well over 200,000 people employed and dependent on the forest sector. So I think we can learn by collaborating together to supporting both workers, firms taking precautions to protect and keep our communities healthy. That will increase the resilience of not only our workers, communities, but firms themselves. And as well, governments needed to step in and provide that emergency assistance. And I think we will reap the rewards in a green economic recovery, and where diversity and inclusion is foundational, a fundamental value of Canada's recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Beth. And it sounds like you've redefined working from home there as, because the forest is your home for 200,000 people, they've always working from home, and that is the forest. So thanks, and we'll come back to you later on in the session. We're going to have a slight change in the program here because our representative from Chad has a clash. So with the permission of the other panelists, we'd just like to ask now Miss Hindu Umaru Ibrahim. She is from the Association of Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad, otherwise known as AFPAT. So Hindu, please feel free to speak to us in French or English, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tony, and hi, everyone. Sorry, it's going on actually the facilitative working group of the local communities and indigenous people platform workshop. So that's why I have to share my time between this panel and then the other workshop that is happening now. So it's really a great pleasure to be with all of you in this incredible discussion about the forest. As representing indigenous peoples, and as coming also from Chad, where we have part of the Congo Basin, for us, we always call forest home. Forest, it's our home. Forest, it's our supermarkets. Forest, it's our pharmacy. Forest is our school. Forest is our energy. It is the source of our survival. It is the place where we get the clean water and where we can get the clean air to breathe and be alive. So for indigenous peoples, I think millions of us, it's over 600 millions that living and depending from the forest across the Congo Basin, Amazon, or Indonesia. So for us, we always have our life and livelihood linked and depending from this environment and from this nature called forest.
Hindu, why we've got you here for these precious moments before you've got to dash out to your other group. Chad is a country affected by climate change tremendously, and it's not a future problem, it's today. And we've seen those images and satellite pictures of Lake Chad and its retraction and the loss of forest cover. So what does forestry mean in a setting for indigenous people, and particularly youth? Do youth see a connection with forestry in the way that perhaps other generations did? And are they relating forestry and climate change and prospects for doing things differently?
Well, I think I start saying that for indigenous peoples, like for me and other colleagues, forest is our home. So then, of course, coming to your questions that climate change has changed a lot, not only the forest as trees. It's changed all the species that living in the forest, because for us, when we call it home, it is not the numbers of the trees, it is a jungle or it is a primary or secondary forest. It is all the species from the birds to the insect to all the plants, herb that living in the forest. And they are getting now impacted just by the climate change. We are seeing the fires going around all the forests who are tropical, humid. Normally there is no fire can go there. And we are seeing also the illegal logging and especially the industrialized agriculture that cutting the forests for the economic reasons. So for us, it is not the economic reason that count. It's the spirituals, it's the relationship, it's human being as a species that count for us as a forest. Let me give you the examples as I am coming from Chad. Chad is a big country with 3 different landscapes. 100% desert, and we have savannas in Sahel regions, and we have the tropical forest. So our forest cover is about 36%, just like 20 years ago. And now we have less than 20% cover. So all the 11% loss, we are losing not only the trees, we are losing the greenhouse emission that increasing into the atmosphere. So that created the desertification advance in our regions. And when the desertification advance, there is not enough forest for our livelihood or energy. So there is conflict between the communities. There is migration, internal migration, where the communities have to leave from the north to go to the south just to get access to the water and to get access to the food and pastures. And this also impacted a lot our health as human beings, because if you don't have a clean space, you don't have the trees that create the atmosphere where you can get the clean air, so you get also not good healthy. If our forests are not healthy, so we are not healthy as human beings also. It is the same what indigenous peoples experiencing, loss of the biodiversity in our lives.
Great. So if we can look ahead, Hindu, to the year 2045, and you've highlighted a lot of the challenges and some of the needs, what will be the solutions? How can we prevent it getting worse at a local level, at a national level, at an international level? And particularly recognizing, as our colleague from Canada mentioned, the need for that inclusivity, that it is forests and forest issues and their relationship with the forest stewards are a societal need and responsibility, and not just for our forest keepers. What can you give us some insights into that, please?
Well, I mean, if we project the next 25 years, I think we have to play in the scenarios. When we see from what scientists telling us that the Amazon is already in the tipping point, and when we see that there are not enough action to protect the forest, to protect the peoples of the forest, the land that forest is, I think in the next 25 years it's going to be a big catastrophic than ever. But the second scenario is if we start acting now, protecting all the forests, restoring the biodiversity laws, making the right laws. I totally agree with what Beth said, that inclusiveness is very important. Justice, equity, inclusiveness of all the peoples, recognition of the rights. If we have all this coming in, I think we can give hope and rebuild a better futures for all of us. So we must all work together. I hear also what Hakim say. We need the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, because they are also part of the driver who can help us to restore our forests. And totally agree, we cannot implement the SDG in silo. We have to implement the 17 goals together. And then the number 17 is very important, the partnership. So if the governments recognize the rights of indigenous peoples, respect the rights of indigenous peoples, and then they land and we protect the forest. If the corporate, all the private sectors, stop all the mining in the forest, stop the business of investing in the deforestations, and if the civil society is stand up with indigenous peoples, all of us come together, and we can work together, we can find a better future in the next 25 years. Maybe we can restore at least the 2/3 of the forest that we lost. And it is not restoring the trees. It is not about planting just the trees. It is the relationship between human being and the nature. That is the most important. We need to rebuild it, how we can live in harmony with our forest, how we can keep our forest, who can have rights equally like human beings, because we are only one species among all the trees and the other insects that living in our forests.
Wow, you've painted a wonderful picture for us there, Hindu, of the living forests in Chad and the relationship with peoples there. So thank you tremendously for your intervention. When the lockdown is over and we can start traveling again, let's make sure that we get Akam Steiner, the Executive Director of UNDP, to come not only to Jordan to work with Khalid and on their brand new forest policy and making sure resources flow, but to those wonderful, obviously, communities, people in the living forests of Chad. So thank you very much for your interventions, Hindu, and we will follow progress in Chad and with indigenous peoples rigorously. Thank you. And that brings us to our fourth panelist today, and that is Mr. Leon Jorge Castaños, who is the Director General of Mexico's National Forestry Commission. Are you with us, Leon? Okay.
Estamos presentes.
Okay, great. So Leon is going to speak to us in Spanish. So please go to the bottom bar to the interpretation button and hit the language that you would like to listen to his Spanish in. Don't click Spanish because, well, click Spanish if you want to hear it in Spanish. Click your language if what you want to hear it in. So to Leon, the Director General of Mexico's National Forestry Commission. So for Mexico and Latin America and the Caribbean in general, what is the biggest regional challenge of the past which forestry has helped to solve? And what lessons can be drawn from those regional efforts from particularly Mexico, but also neighboring countries in the Caribbean and Latin America? Leon.
Honrado en participar, difícil generalizar y definir el desafío mayor cuando en esta región hay tanta diversidad de condiciones, historiales, capacidades. Recordemos que la región comprende países exportadores a países deficitarios, que se cuentan con tenencias de la tierra distintas, desde las comunitarias a las predominantemente privadas, así como bioculturalidades diferentes. Dicho lo anterior, destaco 5 desafíos para la región. El primero, el coadyuvar a resolver la satisfacción de la demanda de madera de la sociedad a través del manejo forestal sustentable del bosque natural y o de las plantaciones forestales comerciales, agroforestales y silvopastoriles. Lograr lo anterior preferentemente bajo sistemas sustentables en que los bosques y las plantaciones no disminuyan, sino que aumenten y se mejoren. El segundo desafío sería centrar las acciones y la atención de las políticas públicas para disminuir la pobreza, marginación y mejorar la calidad de vida de la población que vive en y depende de los recursos forestales. La tercera, promover acciones de prevención y responsabilidad compartida en el combate entre los distintos actores en materia de incendios forestales. La afectación en la Amazonía, en Chile, en Honduras, en México y otros países de la región ha evidenciado su importancia. Cuarto, aportar servicios ambientales o ecosistémicos, conservación de la biodiversidad, protección de los suelos, mantener la disponibilidad de agua para consumo humano, producción agroalimentaria y generación de electricidad, así como la captura de CO2. Y el quinto es el detener o reducir procesos de deforestación y degradación, tala ilegal o comercio ilegal de productos forestales y al mismo tiempo aumentar la restauración funcional de los paisajes forestales a través de la sucesión vegetal o de la reforestación. ¿Qué lecciones aprendidas? Destaco 4. En varios países de la región ha sido común trabajar en el territorio rural en forma aislada, descoordinada y no alineada en políticas, visiones, incentivos con otros sectores. Es trascendente trabajar no solo con los sectores involucrados en la actividad forestal, sino con los del territorio o paisaje rural. Impulsar las estrategias nacionales Red Plus, identificar y reconocer que otras políticas como la agropecuaria, la agraria, la del agua, energía, comunicaciones, minería y salud impactan de manera muy importante en los ecosistemas forestales. Segundo, en México, donde los recursos forestales pertenecen en forma predominante a la propiedad social o comunal, la mejor forma de proteger y conservar los bosques y lograr un aprovechamiento sustentable es con la participación directa y la apropiación de los dueños y poseedores en los beneficios que se obtengan de la silvicultura, cadenas de valor y diversificación productiva. También la necesidad de incluir a las mujeres y a los jóvenes como difusores y agentes de cambio en la temática ambiental, la biodiversidad y el manejo forestal sostenible. La tercera lección sería que en muchos países de la región aún no se logra posicionar al sector en la medida que su importancia lo demanda en la prioridad de las políticas públicas nacionales, económicas, financieras, sociales y ambientales, y tampoco en los recursos destinados para el manejo sostenible de los bosques, su conservación y restauración. Pero tampoco en muchos se ha logrado que toda la sociedad esté consciente de lo que representan para ellos su sobrevivencia, salud, bienestar y el consumo responsable de los productos forestales legales. Finalmente, señalar que recientemente el COVID-19 ha tenido un gran impacto en el sector forestal y presenta un reto inesperado e inédito para la región que tardaremos tiempo en salir y recuperarnos.
Thank you very much, Leon. Now, we understand that you are the nominee for the chair and proposed as the chair for the next session of COFO. So if you were, it'll be a privilege to listen to you and to hear you and see you steer that process, COFO26 in 2 years' time. But imagine you were the chair for the 36th session in the year 22 years ahead of today. You get the opportunity to set the agenda. You're the one who's setting priorities out. Using your crystal ball, Leon, what do you feel would be some of the items on that agenda, specifically for Mexico and Latin America and the Caribbean?
Primero, decir que sería un milagro si sobrevivo en los próximos 22 años, pero los temas que sugeriría analizar e integrar dependerían de los avances, las evaluaciones y predicciones para tener en ese momento una mejor visión del sector forestal mundial en el año 2042. Sin esa bola de cristal, incluiría y anticiparía los siguientes cuestionamientos y temas. El primero, preguntaría cómo el sector forestal contribuyó a mitigar el cambio climático y el cumplimiento de la meta del Acuerdo de París, así como cómo se logró la conservación de la biodiversidad mundial. Segundo, la contribución de los bosques al bienestar de las naciones, incluyendo la demanda creciente de bienes y servicios ambientales. Establecería también cuáles serían los avances en este periodo de la biotecnología, la innovación tecnológica y el uso de aplicaciones digitales en el sector, y cómo si se lograron nuevos y mejores bienes y servicios en los ecosistemas forestales. También cómo se amplió su participación y contribuyeron los pueblos originarios, las comunidades locales, los propietarios particulares, mujeres y jóvenes, en este esquema que se habla de producir conservando y conservar produciendo, y cómo se tradujo en mejorar la calidad de vida. También plantearía qué lecciones aprendidas y nuevos esquemas de implementación del manejo integral del territorio rural y cómo fue la coordinación y la transversalidad entre sectores agrícola, forestal, agua, etcétera, para detener la deforestación y armonizar eso que ahora nos preocupa de la producción sostenible agropecuaria combinada con la protección de los recursos forestales. También plantearía cuál fue el balance de la participación de las empresas privadas consumidoras de productos agropecuarios en la cadena de suministro libres de deforestación. Plantearía también qué mecanismos fueron desarrollados y qué acciones se tomaron para enfrentar los impactos negativos ante nuevas pandemias como la que ocurrió en el 2020 con el COVID-19 y cómo afectó al sector y los recursos forestales. Plantearía también cuáles serían los nuevos perfiles de los profesionales, investigadores, técnicos y extensionistas para apoyar a la silvicultura del futuro. Y finalmente, preguntaría cuál es el papel de los bosques y los espacios verdes en la mejora de la salud física y mental de la población y la vida de las ciudades. Muchas gracias.
Wow, Leon, thank you very much for a tremendous answer there to the question. I think, yes, your years have given you wisdom and tremendous insight, but the youthfulness, the vibrancy, the energy, the passion in your answers convince us that you will be there still for COFO26 in 22 years' time. So we've all had a sneak preview at the agenda that we can be looking at. So we've looked at 2 points of view from the Americas. We've looked at 2 points of view from Mediterranean and Africa. And it now brings us to tie those two together, not through a conservation perspective per se, or specifically climate, but the fact that we use forests and we have industries around forests and we have livelihoods and we have products and services that we seek to enter and prosper and benefit from. And it's a pleasure to have Ms. Karina Hawkinson, who is the chairperson of the Advisory Committee on Sustainable Forest-Based Industries. So good afternoon, Karina, to you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So Karina, if you were to make a prediction, what in your view would be the key challenge that the forest industry is going to be tackling 25 years from now? And when we say the forest industry, you can think about that entire value chain and all of the actors involved and markets involved in it. So what are your predictions, Karina?
The forest industry will be grappling with the rest of the world, how to adapt to a world with a changing climate. And that's an enormous challenge for all of us. But on the other hand, the forest industry has a lot to offer in terms of solutions, mitigating climate change, as everything that can be made of oil also can be made of wood. That can sound a little bit strange, but isn't, as oil is made of biomass from the very, very beginning. So I think that now and in the coming 25 years, when we no longer should, or at least we should minimize our use of fossil fuel-based products, my prediction is that the demand of nature products based on renewable resources will continue to grow, probably dramatically. We can already see that trend, the trend that needs to be even stronger, that more wood is used as construction materials, including multi-story buildings. We will use more paper instead of plastic, use medicals coming from forests, and we will wear textiles based on wood fibers. We will produce biochemicals, biofuel, carbon fiber, fish food, and we will use products based on wood that none of us here have ever even thought of today. And with this vision, a key challenge for the forest sector will be its capacity to deliver on that demand. I'm talking about land availability for growing forests, but also increased productivity of the forest, and both those factors are crucial. I think it's obvious that the world need more forests of many reasons. We have heard some of them already here today. The climate, of course, biodiversity, of course, restoration, etc. And we also need more wood from harvested, sustainable managed forests. And if we are to succeed, we really need the will and the acceptance of the society and the politicians to secure that there is land available, to support and stimulate wood production and the use of forests in a higher extent. So in summary, the world will want more forest products in 25 years, and the challenge is to deliver upon that demand.
Kiitos. So, Karina, what can the ACSFI, the Advisory Committee on Sustainable Forest Industries, and governments, member governments here do to address that change? We're going to have more of this. You mentioned a lot on the move from fossil fuels to living fuels, renewables. If we don't just want a plastic, steel, and glass future, how we're going to be using wood in those ways? What are some of the concrete actions that your group and the governments can do to foster that, to accelerate it, to bring capital into that enterprise?
Yes, there's a lot to do, and for us in ICSFI, it is of great importance to influence and support the FAO to pursue the issue of sustainable forestry, contributing to sustainable society and development. And decision makers should be embracing the opportunity that the forest sector offers the world and implementing the policies that is needed for its renewable resource to serve sustainable development and the climate in an even higher extent than today. The private sector that I am working in, with all our knowledge, innovation capacity and commitment, we are a stakeholder in this ambition, and we are fully available to collaborate with FAO, with other development partners and member countries to ensure that forestry and forest products contribute to achieving the SDGs at scale and with the desired impacts. The forest sector, including the ICSFI and the governments, need to communicate its message around the world of this vast number of essential products that is produced to ensure that as many people as possible knows and appreciate how heavily we rely on forest products in our daily life. And this has been very obvious during the current COVID-19 pandemic. Not only have forest products wrapped the packages that we deliver, they also provide, and we heard that from Canada also earlier at this seminar, provides personal protective equipment, hygiene and sanitary products, biomass for heating, biomass for electricity, ethanol for sanitizer, and respirator paper. So I would also take this opportunity to mention that this week the ICSFI, which represent the private forest sector from around the world, is realizing a statement this week at COFO to highlight that forest products have a key role to play on Build Back Better post-COVID in a sustainable way. And FAO can and is of course already playing a key role in this endeavor. And as chair of its advisory committee on sustainable forest-based industries, I can assure you that we will continue to identify ways of how we together can position the forest sector as a cornerstone for sustainable development, a facilitator of change towards the circular bioeconomy, and a game changer to build back better in this aftermath of the COVID pandemic to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Great, thank you very much, Karina. So that concludes the 5 panelists, but we've got some questions coming in here. And the first question is for Khalid. So Khalid, you mentioned your new and very young forest management policy, only 2 months old. And the question relates to your call for resources. So a very valid call because we don't prioritize funding enough to forestry. So what are the top 3 things within your forest management policy do you think that you need those resources for? And at what type of scale? And how can FAO and others help shine a spotlight on that to make that change? Khalid, are you still with us?
Yes, I am with you. Okay, I will speak in Arabic.
Please.
I will back بالعودة إلى السؤال السابق حول الحلول اللي كنا نحكي عنها. زي ما يعرف جميع الأعضاء بمنظمة الأغذية والزراعة والجهات الداعمة أن الأردن يعاني من الفقر والبطالة كثيرا وقلة فرص العمل في ظل الظروف اللي تمت بالمنطقة. فحبيت أنوه للنقطة هاي الرئيسية. فالغابات هي زي ما يعرف الجميع هي مصدر آخر للحصول على دخول لهذه المجتمعات. فالأردن زي ما ذكرت سابقا له الكثير من الملاحظات حول الدعم على قطاع الغابات. يوجد دعم من الجهات كما ذكرت، إلا أنه نطلب مزيد من الدعم في هذا القطاع. بالعودة إلى سؤالك أخي العزيز، بس لو تعيد لي مرة أخرى إذا سمحت لي.
Sure. So the question, Khalid, is specific. A new forest management policy. You mentioned the very legitimate need for extra resources. What would your top 2 or 3 priorities be for funding? What are the most pressing needs for Jordan?
أكيد يعني أهم 3 أولويات اللي هو الجانب الاقتصادي الاجتماعي، وخصوصا اللي تم دراسته من خلال وثيقة سياسة واستراتيجية الغابات بالأردن. الجانب الاقتصادي الاجتماعي هو مهم جدا للأردن لمواجهة الظروف الطارئة اللي يمر بها الأردن. دعم المجتمعات المحلية، دعم جميع من هم قريبين من الغابات، هاي أولوية. الإطار المؤسسي اللي تم ذكره بسياسة الغابات أيضا من خلال تعاون جميع الجهات سواء كانت حكومية أو جهات أهلية أولوية. أيضا أولوية عندنا موضوع الحرائق الغابات. حرائق الغابات تعرض الأردن كثير من حرائق الغابات نتيجة عدة أسباب، وهذا يتطلب دعم لقطاع الغابات عندنا من أجل الحفاظ على ما هو متوفر حاليا وتنمية الغابات الأخرى اللي نعمل على إعادة تأهيلها من جديد. إعادة تأهيلها من جديد يعطي فرصة جديدة لخلق فرص عمل كما ذكرت، وأيضا موضوع التغير المناخي، موضوع التكيف نشتغل عليه من خلال سياسة الغابات. فالدعم في هذا القطاع يعني يكون ضروري وملح. يعني هاي 3 أولويات نطلب فيها دعم لقطاع الغابات بالأردن. أشكرك.
Great, thank you very much, Khalid. Coming back to Beth, there's a question coming through here in relation to your presentation and looking to the future about the green economy. And we've seen with the COVID-19 that it was framed as a choice between human health and the economy. And most people left out the green dimension of the economy. Most people didn't think about the environmental context. And so how can we elevate the profile of forestry in addition to human health considerations and financial considerations? How do we amplify and leverage and connect to that so that we can raise the understanding, awareness, recognition, and profile, not just in Canada, but in other countries?
That's a big question. I will try to answer that. So as I had mentioned, as we try and stabilize here in Canada, the forest sector, but also other natural resource sectors, whether it be mining or oil and gas, we are trying to reimagine those sectors, and very much the federal government in Canada. There are a couple of priorities for the federal government and direction to all of us as senior officials, and that is to reimagine in the form of a transition to greener sectors. Greener sectors that are much more inclusive, have much more inclusive and diverse workforce. And it's gone so far as to, in our federal programming for forestry firms across the country, that we actually have assessment criteria that are nudging forestry companies in a direction where they have to start to gather evidence and provide data as to the number of Indigenous people, women, and new Canadians that they're recruiting, but not just recruiting a critical mass capacity and developing and supporting them as they assume greater responsibilities in the sector. For Canada, we have started down a path. We have a forest sector bioeconomy framework that has been supported by all provinces and territories. And we're really trying to advance this framework, whether that is through, as Karina had noted, bioenergy, bioheat, bioproducts. One of our firms showed me what looked to be a plastic bottle that you can actually cut up into pieces and throw in what you call our compost bin, our green bin, and it will degrade fairly rapidly here in Canada. And we're into PPE. So we view the bioeconomy and our programming is going to advance and accelerate those efforts in the bioeconomy. The biggest challenge for us with our three subsectors, we have forestry operations, solid wood products. We have new building codes that allow for up to 12-story wood constructed buildings that are being adopted and implemented very widely across Canada. But then the third subsector, pulp and paper, there's the greatest opportunity, or one of the greatest opportunities that we really need to focus on as paper declines around the world. And then I think Canadians more and more are relating to forestry in the time of COVID, because we actually had to stay at home. And for those people in an urban environment who were allowed to go out into their local parks, they realize the close connection of nature and trees and forests to their well-being and their mental health. So I'm quite excited about the future, a green economic recovery, but the recognition that forestry and forest ecosystem offers a multiplicity of benefits for everyone. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Beth. Our next question is for the Director General of Mexico's National Forest Forestry Commission, Leon Jorge Castaños. Leon, you'd mentioned the community groups and how they have helped take over the ownership and management of forests, the famous ejidos in Mexico. How will they look like in the future? What's going to be their needs in changing specifically in Mexico around community forestry management and ownership?
En términos de la tenencia de la tierra en México, una gran mayoría está en manos de lo que llamamos ejidos, comunidades y también pequeños propietarios. Este primer reconocimiento llevó años atrás a replantear una política en donde se buscaba poner en el centro a los campesinos para que ellos pudieran tener su desarrollo. Han pasado ya 30 años de este cambio de política y los resultados es de que quizás hemos logrado llegar apenas a la mitad de lo que son estos núcleos y estas comunidades. Un reto que tiene la institución, el país, es incorporar a esa otra parte, a esos otros 50% que ha estado al margen, que no ha recibido acompañamiento, apoyos. Y si vemos en una pirámide, si imaginamos una pirámide, en México hemos establecido una tipología. En la parte inferior del triángulo está el grupo que no ha sido incorporado y que necesitamos llevarle apoyo, subsidios, acompañamiento. En la medida que en esa pirámide se va subiendo, el valor agregado, la gobernanza, la participación, la organización va subiendo. Entonces tenemos el reto, por un lado, incorporar a esa mitad que está marginada, y ahí están incluidos muchos pueblos originarios. Actualmente tenemos en camino el apoyo a 5 comunidades de pueblos originarios trascendentes en el país, pero también necesitamos que el resto de los que ya están en la producción, en el manejo forestal, vayan aumentando de valor agregado, vayan subiendo su nivel, su escala. Y en ese nivel y avance está también llegar a tener el certificado de manejo sustentable. Entonces, un reto que tienen las comunidades es poder avanzar en ese desarrollo, en esa cadena de valor. La población en los ejidos y comunidades está aumentando, la demanda de empleo está creciendo. Entonces, un reto es que puedan tener un planteamiento integral de sus recursos, de su territorio, que no solamente vean la parte forestal, sino que la combinen con la agricultura, con la ganadería, con el pago de servicios ambientales, con la diversificación productiva, con las posibilidades que da el turismo de naturaleza. Entonces, el reto que tienen las comunidades es mejorar sus niveles de desempeño. Tenemos en la institución iniciando la determinación de un índice de emprendimiento. Y hemos en este índice de emprendimiento determinado 5 componentes, de tal manera que estamos en condiciones de saber cada comunidad en qué nivel está. Y a partir de esa línea base, la política, los apoyos, los subsidios van a estar dirigidos para que vayan mejorando sus índices de emprendimiento. Mejor bosque, mejor manejo del bosque, mejor organización, mejor gobernanza, mejor comercialización, mejor inclusión de sus jóvenes y mujeres. Muchas gracias.
Great, thank you very much, Leon. So final question here, I think we've got a quick one for Karina, is in relation to the forest industries and the low percentage of GDP that is attributed to the forest sector. How can we bring in the full cost and valuation and benefits and and monetize that and have full accounting for forestry through an industry-led process. Karina, briefly.
Sorry, now I'm unmuted. At least here in Sweden, the forest industry takes the lead in how to deliver on the SDGs. They are very ambitious, and they show their goals and the result and their how they move towards the goals every year. Very, very ambitious. We work together in the forest industry with our government to develop how we as a country, of course, but also the forest industry could really support, deliver, and strengthen our work to the SDGs. And I think that from an FAO point, those rather large companies that I represent, they don't need so much help, but FAO could help other forest industry in the rest of the world, or at least in those smaller companies that don't have their own resources to develop their SDGs work. So that could be that's a challenge, and it should be something that FAO would catch up on.
Great, thanks very much. We have 5 minutes now just to try and summarize all of your wonderful thoughts, the presentation from ACM as a takeaway from this high-level dialogue. So please allow me to give a very short summary of what we've heard and to try and weave it into 4 take-home points. So from Khalid on behalf of Mr. Saleh Karebshe, the Minister of Environment and Acting Minister of Agriculture in Jordan, we heard a lot about the change in forest policy, the need for greater prioritization and focus around economic and social elements in their institutional framework, whilst dealing with immediate crises such as forest fires and other issues. We heard from Beth McNeil of the fantastic response from the Canadian Forest Service to the pandemic and how they were able to continue many of their operations and to show society that the value of forests and to connect the wonderful framework of survive, stabilize, and reimagine. From our dear friend and the nominee for COFO26 chair, Leon Jorge Castaños in Mexico, he spoke a lot about the scale from landscape to community to private enterprise, of bringing in the forest and the rural dimension, the dimensions of women and youth, and the 5 challenges that he proposed to us. And not to think of forests just as timber, but water, energy, health, communities, and partnerships across ministries. From Karina, the chairperson of the Advisory Committee on Sustainable Forest-Based Industries, we heard a lot about the tremendous diversity and opportunities, the wonderful, new products, the uses, and yes, there will be a change from some products to others, but great optimism there in the forest industries, and an opportunity for private sector and industry to lead and to connect, interface with societies and with governments, and that was very endearing. And from the wonderfully colorful and energetic Ms. Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, who was representing the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad, she reminded us that the forest is not just a group of trees, but really living, and how that is affecting all of the social processes of migration, of environmental stability in Chad, and its effect on not just Chad, but other indigenous peoples to protect the forest by protecting people and giving them rights and laws and rightly justice and equity as well. So running through those and the wonderful presentation that we had from Akam Steiner, the Executive Director of the UNDP, I think we probably have 4 take-home points. One is about people, that this is about rural enterprises and rural people, indigenous peoples, people living in cities and urban areas, forest professionals and educationists, the need for inclusiveness, and also to link up with subnational government level in countries. Second point, forests are not just clumps of trees. They're a living entity. They provide ecosystem services. They connect us, and we need to view them in that holistic way. The third point that clearly shone through was green energy, green products, and to remind ourselves that nothing is better than a tree at sequestering carbon, cycling water from depth, providing a framework for biodiversity, and affecting our microclimate. And when we think that, you know, the climate change, the difficulties that we're dealing with are about solar energy and how it's used and reflected and absorbed, and how we're heating up tremendously. And when we think of energy, you know, we know that solar cells are now up to 35% efficient, and we know that batteries are 80 and 90% sufficient. And whilst the leaves on trees may only be 3% efficient, the batteries are incredibly efficient. That is the wood in trees. Not only that, you can't stack photovoltaic cells on top of one another. You can't put solar panels one on top of another. In a tree, because of the leaf area index going up to 20, we can stack 20 panels on top of each other. So the individual leaf may only be 3% efficient. But when you factor that in with additional leaf, multiply it by leaf area index, we get efficiencies of light conversion then far greater than any photovoltaic cell. So let's use those wonderful drivers and converters of energy as well. And I think the final point for us all to end on, and we hope can be reflected in the report from this high-level dialogue session as well, is connections. How we link up all of the wonderful points that the panelists made and connected us to the SDGs, but also to the drives for nature-based solutions, for the UN Decade on Ecological Restoration, to the circular economy and agroecology and other great moves. So on behalf of the now 270 odd participants that have been watching through the Zoom chat room, this has also been shared through web. It's very hard in Zoom when everyone's on mute, but allow me to, on behalf of you all, give applause to FAO as organizers, but also to our panelists and keynote speaker. Thank you very much for listening.